Who are conducting an intensive investigation into the poisoning deaths feel tonight that some progress is being made in the search for the killer or killers. They are zeroing in on fewer than a dozen suspects.
Back in 1982, if you had a headache, you probably reached for Tylenol. It was that little red and white capsule, a familiar sight in medicine cabinets everywhere. Tylenol wasn't just a pill, it was a promise of relief, a symbol of trust, a staple of American life. It was considered completely safe. But on the morning of September 29th, in a quiet suburb of Chicago, that trust was obliterated. When 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up with a cold, her parents gave her an extra-strength Tylenol, expecting she'd feel better in no time. Instead, minutes later, she collapsed on the bathroom floor. She was pronounced dead soon after. This wasn't just a one-off tragedy. It was the first tremor of a nationwide panic, the start of a medical mystery that would change the world, and the beginning of a hunt for a new kind of killer, one who could turn medicine into a weapon. The investigation would become a maze of bizarre clues, but at its dark centre stood one man, James Lewis. He was a master of manipulation, a man of many faces, and the prime suspect in a crime he was never actually charged with. This is the twisted tale of James Lewis and the Tylenol murders, a story where the truth is far more complicated than you could ever imagine. A child's death is always a tragedy, but the shocking, sudden nature of Mary Kellerman's passing left everyone reeling. An autopsy would later uncover the horrifying truth. The Tylenol she took was laced with a fatal dose of potassium cyanide. But before anyone knew that, the invisible killer was already striking again. That same day, in Arlington Heights, another Chicago suburb, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus took a Tylenol for a minor ache. He collapsed and died at the hospital, with doctors initially blaming a massive heart attack. His family, completely shattered, gathered at his home to mourn. In their grief, Adam's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley, and Stanley's wife, 19-year-old Teresa, both came down with headaches. Looking for relief, they reached for the exact same bottle of Tylenol Adam had used. Just moments later, Stanley collapsed and died. Teresa was rushed to the hospital, but she died 2 days later. 3 people from the same family, dead in less than 48 hours. This grim cluster of deaths was the turning point. 2 sharp off-duty firefighters, Philip Capitelli and Richard Keyworth, connected the dots. They'd heard the Janus deaths on their scanners and remembered the report about Mary Kellerman. They voiced a chilling suspicion. Could Tylenol be the link? A public health nurse, Helen Jensen, went to the Janus home and found the fateful bottle. As soon as she and investigators opened it, they smelled the faint almond-like scent of cyanide. The alarm was sounded, a terrifying pattern was emerging across the Chicago area. Over the next few days, 3 more people fell victim. Mary Reiner, a 27-year-old new mother, Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old worker at the phone company, and Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant. Every single one of them had just wanted a little relief from a common ailment. Every one of them had trusted that red and white capsule, and every one of them was dead. 7 victims, all killed by the same invisible hand. News of the poisonings unleashed a firestorm of panic. This wasn't just a local story, it was a national nightmare. Police cars rolled through Chicago neighborhoods, blaring warnings from megaphones. Do not take Tylenol. Volunteers went door to door, begging people to throw away any Tylenol they owned. The manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, found itself in an unthinkable crisis. In what is now considered a landmark move of corporate responsibility, they issued a massive nationwide recall, pulling 31 million bottles off the shelves at a cost of over $100 million. The fear was everywhere. One of the most basic acts of trust in modern life, taking a sealed over-the-counter pill had been violated. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just who did this, but how. Investigators figured out pretty quickly that the tampering didn't happen at the factories. The poison was added after the bottles were already on store shelves. The killer, or killers, had walked into multiple stores, bought bottles of Tylenol, carefully opened the capsules, swapped the medicine with cyanide, and put the poison packages back for anyone to buy. It was a crime of terrifying randomness and chilling intimacy. The killer had no idea who their victims were, but they orchestrated their deaths with a meticulous, invisible cruelty. The hunt for this phantom killer was on, and it was about to lead investigators down a very strange path to a man who seemed to enjoy the chaos. The task force trying to catch the Tylenol killer was facing an unbelievable challenge. They had 7 victims in different Chicago suburbs with no obvious connection other than the poisoned pills. There was no crime scene in the traditional sense. The murder weapons were store-bought and the killer had left no fingerprints on the recovered bottles or capsules. With the technology available in 1982, there was no DNA evidence to look for. They were hunting a ghost. This was a new kind of criminal. It wasn't a crime of passion or personal revenge. It was remote control murder, a form of domestic terrorism that attacked the very idea of public trust. The randomness was the whole point. The killer could be anyone. Was it a disgruntled employee, a mad scientist, someone just trying to watch the world burn? The investigation became a frantic race against time. The FBI teamed up with local and state police, creating a task force of over 100 investigators. They painstakingly traced the lot numbers on the poisoned bottles, which confirmed the tampering had to have happened locally. The 5 tainted bottles they recovered came from different stores, suggesting the killer moved around the Chicago area, planting their deadly traps. The public was terrified, but also a potential source of clues. A hotline was swamped with thousands of tips. Anyone who was disgruntled, had a chemistry set, or had ever made a threat was suddenly a person of interest. One man, a dock worker named Roger Arnold, was looked into after a bar owner told police Arnold had been talking about poisons. It turned out to be a dead end, but the stress of the investigation had its own tragic consequences. Arnold, convinced the bar owner snitched on him, later shot and killed a man he mistook for the owner in an act of misplaced revenge. The investigation was full of dead ends and false leads. Police even briefly considered if the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, might be responsible since his first crimes were in the Chicago area, but he was eventually ruled out. The case was getting colder by the day. They knew how it was done, cyanide in capsules, but they had no idea who did it, or, more importantly, why. What could possibly be the motive for something so horrible? Then, about a month after the poisonings, a letter showed up at the corporate headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. It was postmarked from Chicago, and its contents completely changed the direction of the investigation. It was a demand for $1 million. The author claimed responsibility for the murders and promised to stop the killing if the money was paid. Suddenly, the faceless killer had a voice, and that voice belonged to a man named James Lewis. The extortion letter was the first real break in the case. While it could have just been some sick opportunist, investigators believed it contained details about the crime that hadn't been released to the public, which gave it a chilling sense of authenticity. The demand was very specific. The $1 million was to be sent to the bank account of a travel agency that had gone out of business. This wasn't a random choice, and it became the first thread investigators could pull. The defunct travel agency had been owned by a man named Frederick Miller McCahey. A little digging uncovered a disgruntled former employee, Leanne Lewis. Her last paycheck had bounced, and she'd had a dispute with McCahey over her pay. And when investigators looked into Leanne, they found her husband, James William Lewis. Born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1946, James Lewis was a man who seemed to drift through life with a chip on his shoulder and a dark kind of intelligence. Police would later call him a chameleon. He used at least 20 different aliases and worked all sorts of jobs. Accountant, computer specialist, you name it. He and his wife Leanne had a daughter, Toni, who was born with Down syndrome and a heart defect. Tony tragically died in 1974 at age 5 after a surgery. Lewis himself would later claim that the sutures used in her surgery were made by a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, hinting at a possible deeply personal grudge against the company. But Lewis's past was much darker than a string of failed jobs and personal tragedy. In 1978, while living in Kansas City, he was charged with the grisly murder of a 72-year-old client named Raymond West. West's dismembered body was found in his attic the same day Lewis tried to cash a forged check from West's account. It was a horrific crime, but Lewis walked free. The case was thrown out on a technicality. A judge ruled that police hadn't read him his rights properly. He had escaped a murder charge, but his criminal life continued. In 1981, he was convicted of mail fraud for a credit card scam. This was the man now at the top of the Tylenol suspect list. The letter was the link. Investigators tracked its origins and learned that James and Leanne had recently lived in Chicago, but had moved to New York City just weeks before the poisonings. This fact would become a major sticking point later on, but for now they were the focus of a massive nationwide manhunt. The search for the Lewises was a media circus. Their faces were everywhere. In December 1982, the hunt came to an end. A librarian at the New York Public Library recognized James from a wanted poster and called the cops. He and Leanne were arrested. Lewis didn't put up a fight. In fact, he seemed almost eager to talk. He quickly admitted he wrote the extortion letter, but he flatly denied having anything to do with the murders. His story was that the letter was just a bizarre scheme to get revenge on his wife's old boss, McKay. He claimed that by having the ransom sent to McKay's old business account, he hoped the full force of the law would come crashing down on the man. It wasn't a real attempt to get money, he said, just a convoluted plot to frame an old enemy. But as investigators kept digging, the case against James Lewis started to look a lot bigger than just one weird letter. With James Lewis in custody, the government had their man, but not for the crime everyone was talking about. They just couldn't physically tie him to the poisonings in Chicago. So prosecutors went after what they could prove, the extortion letter. In 1983, Lewis was tried for attempted extortion. His own lawyer admitted he wrote the letter but argued it was never about the money. It was a misguided stunt to point out security flaws and get back at his wife's old boss. The jury didn't buy it. Demanding $1 million to stop the killing is extortion, period. James Lewis was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, ultimately serving nearly 12. But even as he was sentenced, investigators and the public felt this was only part of the story. The circumstantial evidence pointing to him as the Tylenol killer was deeply unsettling. First, there was the letter itself. According to investigators, it contained information that suggested the author knew things about the crime that hadn't been made public. Even more damning, years later, new technology allowed investigators to enhance the postmark on the letter. It was dated October 1st, 1982. Lewis had told people it took him 3 days to write the letter. If that was true, it meant he would have started writing it before the first news reports about the poisonings even aired, which suggested he knew about it because he was the one who did it. Then there was what investigators found when they searched his things. They turned up a book about poisons, and according to law enforcement documents, Lewis's fingerprints were on the pages that specifically talked about cyanide. It was a chilling discovery that linked him directly to the murder weapon. But maybe the strangest and most incriminating evidence came from Lewis himself. After his arrest, and even from prison, Lewis seemed to love playing a cat and mouse game with the FBI. He offered to help them solve the murders. He gave them stunningly detailed scenarios of how the killer could have pulled it off. He even drew detailed diagrams, including one showing a drilled board method for quickly filling capsules with poison. He calmly explained how anybody could have done it, walking authorities through a step-by-step guide. To investigators, this wasn't some amateur detective trying to help. This felt like a confession disguised as a hypothetical. He was showing them exactly how he did it, all while hiding behind a shield of plausible deniability. It was a display of breathtaking arrogance. Here was a man already convicted of trying to profit from the tragedy, now seemingly taunting the very people trying to solve it. For many in law enforcement, there was no doubt. James Lewis was the Tylenol killer. The only problem was they couldn't prove it. Despite all the circumstantial evidence and the gut feeling of so many investigators, the case against James Lewis was never a slam dunk. For every piece of evidence that pointed to him, there was a counter-argument, a shadow of a doubt, that kept prosecutors from ever charging him with the 7 murders. The biggest problem for the prosecution was Lewis's alibi. At the time of the poisonings in late September 1982, James and Leanne were living in New York City. They had a paper trail, rent payments, job applications, placing them on the East Coast when the poisoned bottles were put on Chicago store shelves. Is it possible he secretly flew to Chicago, committed the crimes, and flew back without anyone noticing? Maybe, but it was highly unlikely and impossible to prove. Without anything placing him physically in Chicago, a murder charge just wouldn't stick. As former Chicago Police Superintendent Richard Brechek later said, James Lewis was an asshole, but he wasn't the Tylenol killer. His motive for writing the letter was also all over the place. First, he said it was to embarrass his wife's former boss. Other times, he said it was an emotional outburst. Then there was the theory about his daughter's death and a grudge against Johnson & Johnson. But Lewis contradicted his own stories over the years. This constant shifting made him seem deceptive, but it also made it hard to nail down one clear motive for mass murder. Was he a grieving father, a cold-blooded extortionist, or a narcissist whose prank went horribly wrong? Lewis's psychological profile screamed narcissist and master manipulator. He craved attention and loved feeling like the smartest person in the room. His help for the FBI could be seen as the ultimate act of hubris, a way to put himself at the centre of the biggest crime story in the country. Writing the extortion letter fits that perfectly. But does a narcissist who wants attention become an anonymous killer? The two profiles don't always match up. The Tylenol killer was a ghost. James Lewis wanted everyone to know his name. And of course, there was the total lack of direct physical evidence. In 2010, the FBI renewed its investigation, and Lewis and his wife voluntarily gave their DNA and fingerprints. He was confident, saying, "If the FBI plays it fair, I have nothing to worry about." And he was right. No matches were ever found. The lingering doubt allowed other theories to hang around. Some wondered if the tampering happened higher up the supply chain. Others thought there might be another suspect who flew completely under the radar. The case was further complicated by a 1986 copycat killing in New York, where a woman died from a poisoned Tylenol capsule while Lewis was in prison. James Lewis was the perfect suspect. He was a convicted extortionist with a dark past who loved to play mind games. He fit the part of the villain perfectly. But in the American legal system, fitting the part isn't enough. Without direct evidence and with a solid alibi, the case against him for murder remained what it always was. A compelling, deeply disturbing, but ultimately unprovable theory. While we may never know who the killer was, the Tylenol murders of 1982 permanently changed America. The random, invisible nature of the crime created a national crisis of confidence. If you couldn't trust a sealed bottle of medicine, what could you trust? The incident marked a profound loss of innocence, and the response to it reshaped an entire industry. The most visible legacy of the Tylenol murders is probably in your medicine cabinet right now. Before 1982, medications came in simple bottles, often with just a screw cap and a cotton ball inside. The crisis forced a complete revolution in product packaging. Johnson & Johnson, working with the FDA, pioneered what we now call tamper-evident packaging. Those glued flaps on the box, the plastic wrap around the cap, and the foil seal over the bottle's opening. All of that became the new industry standard. The goal wasn't to make things tamper-proof, which is impossible, but tamper-evident, so you could easily see if someone had messed with it. The law changed too. In 1983, Congress passed the Tylenol bill, which made it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. This gave the feds the power to investigate and prosecute these kinds of crimes, which created a strong deterrent. Johnson & Johnson's handling of the crisis is still taught in business schools as a masterclass in crisis management. By immediately recalling all their products and putting public safety over profits, they saved their brand. They reintroduced Tylenol not in the easily opened capsules, but in a new solid pill called the caplet, which was much harder to tamper with. Amazingly, within a year, Tylenol was once again the nation's leading pain reliever. The Tylenol murders also left a deep cultural scar. The panic of 1982 fueled a lasting anxiety about product tampering. Urban legends about poison in Halloween candy, for instance, exploded after the Tylenol scare. The case became a permanent reminder of how vulnerable we are in our daily lives. It showed how one person's evil act could hold an entire nation hostage and fundamentally change the way we live and shop. The 7 victims didn't die in vain. Their tragic deaths sparked a revolution in consumer protection that has undoubtedly saved countless lives. After getting out of prison in 1995, James Lewis didn't just disappear. He and his wife Leanne moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and tried to build a new life, even running a small web design business. But the shadow of the Tylenol murders followed him for the rest of his life. He was always the prime suspect in the public's mind, and for many in law enforcement, he was never really a free man. He continued his strange dance with the media, sometimes giving interviews, other times lashing out. He even made a website where he declared his innocence and claimed he was framed. He was a man who seemed to both crave and hate the infamy the case brought him. His legal troubles weren't over either. In 2004, he faced serious charges in Massachusetts for rape and kidnapping, though they were later dropped after the alleged victim declined to testify. The incident just added another dark layer to his public persona. The Tylenol investigation never officially closed. It remained one of the country's most frustrating cold cases. As technology improved, investigators would periodically re-examine the evidence, always hoping for a breakthrough. In 2009, the case was formally reopened, and Lewis was, once again, the centre of attention. He gave his DNA, he did interviews, and he always maintained his innocence, always one step ahead of any real proof. Recent documentaries have brought the case back into the spotlight, featuring what would be the final extensive interview with James Lewis. In it, he was the same man he'd always been, smart, evasive, and absolutely denying any role in the killings. It was his last performance. On July 9th, 2023, James Lewis was found dead in his Cambridge home at the age of 76. An autopsy confirmed he died of natural causes. No foul play was suspected. His death brought an end to a lifetime of suspicion, but it offered no real closure. For the families of the 7 victims, it was a frustrating end to the story. The man they believed was responsible for their loved ones' deaths died a free man, taking his secrets with him. For the investigators who chased him for decades, his death closed the book on their prime suspect, but it didn't solve the case. The Tylenol murders remain to this day officially unsolved. So what do you think? Was James Lewis the mastermind behind the Tylenol murders, a cold killer who taunted the police for decades? Or was he just a twisted opportunist who got caught in a web of his own making and spent a lifetime under a cloud of suspicion he created himself? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you want to dive into more unsolved mysteries that changed history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next video. The story of the Tylenol murders is more than just a true crime story. It's about trust, fear, and how a single evil act can change everything. 7 innocent people, Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary Reiner, Mary McFarland, and Paula Prince lost their lives because they reached for a remedy. Their deaths sparked a nationwide panic, but they also created a legacy of safety that protects us to this day. And at the centre of it all was James Lewis, a man who will forever be defined by a crime he was never charged with. Was he the phantom killer who terrorised a nation, or just the loudest voice in the chaos? With his death, the full truth may never be known. The case files are still open, a chilling monument to one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we can't see, and the most disturbing questions are the ones that never get answered.